Hey everybody, welcome to the second episode of my podcast, direct from the heart of the wild west of Ireland on this dark, stormy winter's evening. My name is Alan Cooke and the podcast is called Ireland Speaks. And tonight I have another very special guest. He's a good friend of mine, a fellow brother from the landscape of the outer worlds. It's Sean Donoghue, and he's coming live from America, but his trails of his energies and heart and soul are very, very deeply connected into the Irish landscape. And he's a man who's taught me a lot about Irish myths and the divine masculine and all the other aspects that have helped bring me onto other journeys outside of the sort of regular life into, for want of a better word, the medicine of Ireland. So it's lovely to have this technology to be able to converse with someone from so far away and feel like they're in the same room. So let me go straight ahead and introduce Sean. He's a healer, a medicine man, a mythologist, a herbalist. He'll tell you more about what he thinks he is also as well. He's many things actually, and in a very interesting time, we're having this conversation across the waters, but we're connected with the underneath of the landscape together between Ireland and America. So, Sean, welcome to the show. Ireland Speaks. How are you keeping tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, and I'm connected right now to you by a chain of mountains. The mountains that I'm in the west of Maine, the Appalachians, the oldest mountains in North America, dip under the ocean and then cross the ocean and come up again in Ireland. So here we are, along in the shadow of land touched by the same mountains.
It's extraordinary. That's extraordinary, yeah. And how would you, telling the world now, if you were to introduce yourself to just some regular people, how would you describe what you do in simple terms? Like what is it you help people with, or
I would say I help people with finding their way to wholeness and to true sovereignty through connection with living land. This word sovereignty gets thrown around a lot these days, but I don't think people really think about the origin of it. And if we go back to certainly the Irish concept of kingship, just to be sovereign was to be wedded to the land, to be the one who gives your life to the land and to the people. And you could not be sovereign without making that commitment. And then, history moved on and we tried to put that onto the individual, which in some ways is good because the system of kings got corrupt over time. But we lost the fact that it's never something people experience in isolation. It's always about wedding the land. And so I feel like my work is in facilitating that mutual courtship between land and people. Through connecting them with the medicine of plants, through poetry, through telling the old stories, through ritual to honor the ancestors in the land, in order to help people remember who they are.
Before we went on air, so to speak, we were both talking specifically about, I briefly mentioned the thing of the idea of a vertical and a horizontal type of living. Now, a person will go, what do you mean by that? And what I would explain it at is the horizontal world is very much the civilizational world that's being created by how we're living right now, which is the structures of ego and creation of buildings and cars and TV shows and just sort of like an unspiritual and unconnected sort of growth of the other part of mankind, but very much in the other world, which is the vertical world, is where tribes would have looked and praised to the gods, or looked below and seen the demons, seen the shadow, and touched both the grief and the heavens of life. And it's what you went for your grounding when things were unbalanced, or you needed to find wisdom outside of, as I was saying to you earlier, the structure of man. And I don't know what you feel about how we're living right now. How much are we in connection with or out of connection with all of those sources, if they still exist?
Those sources definitely still exist, but I think there's been a severing in two directions. And that more recent severing, which is more recent in history than we acknowledge. So, like, I think of my father had an aunt, Aunt Tessie, who grew up in Cork, who still kept the old ways and still knew about the life of the land and the spirits that inhabited it. She came over and with my great uncle Jiggs, who was born in this country, but was the last member of my direct lineage to speak Irish.
Oh.
And he went back over and found himself a wife, and they came back here and carried some of those connections. And actually, the very first music I ever heard played, my grandfather took me to his brother's house to hear him play the squeeze box in the driveway. So, but circling back to what you were actually asking, I would say that, it's more recent, and it's even still alive in some ways, but it's more recently lost than we think. So 100 years ago, I think people still, in many places, especially in the west of Ireland, were in that deeper connection. And even prior to that, it's not really until the 1600s that we get that deeper connection, having war waged on it by the English in Ireland, right, as they're beginning to wage war on it among the indigenous in North America. But a part of that severing is people being forced away from land and forced away from community and forced into this individual identity. So think about D.H. Lawrence talks about how we can't truly love because our love has been cut off and is bleeding at the root. And we're bleeding at the root because we're uprooted from the land. And so that's one aspect of it. But there's the older aspect as well. And that exists in the stories of the Tuatha, the people of the gods who became the fairy people. And the oldest stories say that they were people who had gone to the north to learn great mysteries from the wise ones who lived beyond the north wind. And then they sailed back on ships through the sky upon the north wind to come into Ireland. And finally, they were driven back in the war with the arrival of the people from Galicia and Spain, the Malaysians. And when they encountered a way of living that involved the sword of iron that cut the flesh and the plow of iron that cut the earth, they no longer wanted to be among this world. So they went to the mouth of the Boyne, where Manannán, god of the sea, gathered them and brought them down below the ancient burial mounds, down below the hollow hills, and wove a spell to make them invisible to those who were hostile to their ways.
Well, now,
and
I'm thinking it's really beautiful hearing this story unfold, and I'm trying to think, like, when people are listening, because there's so much magic in what you're saying, that they'll go, how does that apply to my everyday life, or not paying my bills, or whatever it is? And I think you'd agree that underneath the story, which we'll talk more of, there's the four provinces in Ireland: Ulster, Munster, Leinster, and Connacht. But I also believe, it's my theory, there's a fifth province, I call it. I'd written a talk on it, where exactly what you're talking about, underneath the grief, underneath the mundanity of mortal life, underneath the sort of struggle, the stress, the over-politicization of the soul, there exists exactly that, what you're talking about, this eternal, vibrant, flowering, always existing sort of medicine that people can draw in from the land into themselves, whether it's going out and chopping wood or swimming in the ocean. And when the senses awaken into those, when you give those stories, you're almost touching into the part of an old voice. When you start telling these stories, I start to feel something in me that is like, it goes into that vertical world again. It touches into something that's feels ever giving and immortal. It's like, you know, seeing nature every day, seeing a robin land on a tree is never boring. It's always got some little bit of medicine for you, you know. But go on anyway with the story. I was just trying to give a context to why these stories are important for the Irish soul today, who's become so disconnected from their past, you know.
Absolutely, and to build on that context, I think biology tells us that our natural instincts are towards connection. And if we reach back to the way our ancestors lived, every sip of water that they drank from a wild stream had the medicine of plants that had filtered into it from their roots, as well as in Ireland, the water seeping up through the peat carry the medicine of forests and meadows that died thousands of years ago, and carry that ancient medicine. If you're smelling a peat fire, or if you're drinking a whiskey where you can taste the smoke, you're getting the exhalations of plants thousands of years ago. And so it's this very literal medicine from another time to remind us a way of connecting. And every breath that people breathed in, they'd be breathing in the exhalations of plants filled with healing medicine. Now we live in a time when most of the time we're separated from that, and so people are getting sick, and suddenly they make the amazing discovery that, if you send people out to walk in the woods, breathing in the scent of the plants will improve their blood pressure and improve their blood sugar and bring them back into balance. And we have to give it a name now, forest bathing, instead of it just being the morning walk that would have been true for people for as far back as we can imagine.
Well, it's funny that we've both walked. I've walked a lot of long distances in Ireland, and you've walked a lot of long distances here and back where you live. We were just talking before you came in there, the simple thing of just going down and feeding the birds or leaving food for the fox. I leave food for a cat that comes here, and I'm thinking about Garnish Island. For those who don't know, Garnish Island is in a place in Glengarriff in West Cork. It's a tiny little island off the west coast of Cork. Have you been there, Sean, at Garnish Island? Did you get there yet?
I haven't yet.
Well, Garnish Island is where they say the two of the Danann first landed. Allegedly the first peoples of Ireland landed. And I remember going into that little island, taking the boat across, which is surrounded by seals, which is very symbolic in a way, and very unusual to see that in Ireland. Little Ireland now is protected by the feminine seals. It's very magical little piece of island. You step off the boat, and but I went to the other side of the island where none of the tourists were, and I remember just instinctively there was a little crop of bushes, and I knew the sea was just on the other side, and I opened up these bushes, and there was a tiny little bay there, a tiny little miniature beach, and I felt in my heart, I said, this is where they came. I could almost feel it in my energy of this boat pulling in, of these figures, almost like Lord of the Rings, like these beautiful divine figures stepping off this boat to come down into the earth in a way. And then this place gets a sense of this scholarly energy from the past, you know? And I'm like, it's so beautiful to just go with your imagination, to feel into things. And it's so lost in people here right now. There's such a desperation of crying out for this thing, like you said, that they don't even know the name of it. And when I had the privilege of being on that island and just peering through a veil, a curtain, in a way, and then almost seeing a temporary vision, you know, I was like, Ireland is the dream time. Ireland is, you know, Halloween. It's the solstices. It's God is a knock on the door, you know. And I think having lost our literal language, and I'm reading a book called 32 Names for a Field, which is an extraordinary book about the etymology of Irish phrasing. You must try and get hold of it. And I'm only dipping into it now, but it's, you know.
I'm reading it. My sister just got it for me for Christmas.
Oh, really?
Actually.
Oh, wow. So I haven't got that much into it, but remember at the beginning saying like there's 15 words for a hole left by a cow's footprint, and a hole that's left from a puddle of water, a hole that's borne down over time by water into a rock. And that gives such a different kaleidoscope of how truly there's another language in Ireland, which is the true language, which is As I was talking today about the world, the oratory language is the truth of the world, and that's why it's survived for thousands of years, beyond the colonized academia or beyond the sort of like civilized sort of televisual social media world, that we ultimately still come back to the passing of stories to one another. And we're passing a story to one another now, but I just want to go back without diverging too much. When you came to Ireland and you started exploring the land in detail and in depth, what did you start to find because of your studies and when you were here, traveling and teaching here for a while? Like what came out of you that seemed like me, like to having that moment, a familiar moment like that in the landscape? What were the images or the senses of your identity here in Ireland?
Well, the very first part actually was just the road signs coming out of Shannon Airport, because my great grandmother came from Killarney as a young woman, and once she landed in America, she never spoke a word of English again in her life.
Wow.
Even though in her last years, her eldest son Jiggs and his wife Tessie were the only Irish speakers left in her world. And it was a bit strange because, my grandfather, I grew up with my grandfather, and he didn't have a single word of Irish. And it took me a while to understand exactly what happened. And then I sort of put some pieces together. And part of it was that I think the reason why Nora wouldn't speak English was because once she was here, she was free not to. And if you look at things like the film The Wind That Shakes the Barley, it shows what would happen if you were caught speaking Irish in public by a British soldier. But then there was another layer to it because, my great-grandfather, Daniel Donoghue, who is the namesake of a mythic ancestor, was a captain in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He came over at 21 with a price on his head, landed in East Boston with $5 in his pocket in the name of a cousin, and then moved a little north. And when he moved a little north, he moved to the highest tower in the city, so he could look down. So he'd go out and look out on the harbor every day and make sure that there were no British boats in the harbor coming to get him. But the threat that finally came for him was the Ku Klux Klan, because they were trying to drive the Irish, who weren't considered white at that point, out. And my grandfather remembered his father hiding him from the Klan when they were burning a cross on the top of the hill. And what I've pieced together is that was probably the day that my grandfather lost the Irish language, because so many families would tell their children not to be heard speaking the language outside the house when once the Klan had come to town. Same thing happened with French speakers here in Maine. And so when I saw road signs in the Irish language, and I thought about all that my great-grandparents had been through, I just wept immediately. And I had an understanding. I had heard a lot of Native American friends talk about what it meant for their ancestral language to come back. And I never understood what that meant until I actually saw it on my ancestral homeland. And then, as I settled into the land, I just felt more and more at home. I felt at home with the little remnants of forest I was able to find, in particular, the patch of oak forest that you and I both spent some time in, right in Galway, right at the edge of the Burren, and then in the ancient yew forests around my ancestral castle in Killarney. I felt my body remember things about walking on the earth that it couldn't really know walking on this continent. And my deepest prayer in coming over had been trying to understand, what did masculinity mean to my ancestors before the church and the English imposed a different set of ideas on them. And I'd had a vision a few years earlier than that, where I felt a bunch of my male ancestors standing behind me and saying, when we could make love to the land, we understood that we were kings. But when they took our goddess and they put her behind the communion rail and told us we could not touch her, we forgot that we were kings. And so I wanted to remember that. And I was wandering around in those forests along Loch Lean, and I stood under an old oak and I prayed to know what it was to be a man, what it was to be a chieftain, what it was to be a king. And I rounded a turn, and all of a sudden, a red deer stag came out of the thicket. The stag had antlers as wide as my arm span. And we stood and we looked at each other for a moment. And I just tried to get very, very still and very, very calm, because he was close enough that he could have easily charged me. And he went off and tried to sort of lead me down a trail. And I followed a little bit and saw that actually what he was doing was leading me away from the rest of the herd. And then when he saw me stand still and knew that I wasn't going to threaten the herd, he went back and he walked around the herd in a circle 3 times. And once the perimeter was walked, he went back to the middle of the field and lay down beneath a tree at its center. And we just stood and watched each other over the distance for a long time. At that point, I understood that I had always thought that people thought of the stag as a symbol of the king because the stag looked majestic. But I realized that our ancestors actually learned their mode of kingship from watching the red deer, and the stag was the one who was willing to do what was necessary to keep the people safe, but whose real desire was to just be in that rest and repose and openness at the center.
Do you think, like the images that you're talking about, which I've seen many times in Ireland on my travels here, if you take someone who has, say, a man who's, like, I know there's a high degree of suicides here, and a lot of people who have drank a lot and they take a lot of drugs, and although they look like functioning, underneath all that, they're passing on to several generations of men that literally have destroyed themselves through this imbibing of these addictive energies and these sort of inner dragons or inner demons in a way. The brokenness that's in men in the world, but also say particularly in Ireland and stuff like that. Like, do you think, how do they find in the simplest way their way back to another type of seeing and another way of sort of like for me, when I went through a lot of stuff, it was going out simply to the landscape every day that I was able to sort of burn off or alchemize a lot of the stuff that was hurting me. I didn't go into a sort of pharmaceutical medicines or drinking or whatever. I just somehow was led, I'm very blessed I was, back into a very gentle medicine, which is just simply that of nature. But why do you think it is right now that men are so bereft? I know you've said it because of their disconnect from the land, but how do you tell an average person who's sitting on a train who's like, this is not my life? How do we get people to sort of start moving back home? I don't know if that's even the appropriate term,
Yeah, so I think that a part of it is that we invite it with our own presence. That we invite it by showing up with a different, with our own way of being, with just being authentically and unguardedly ourselves. And by unguarded, I don't mean letting anybody in close to do whatever they want. I mean unafraid of having who we are be truly seen. Because I think so much of what's missing is just example and possibility. And every time we see another who is walking in a different way, it's not something that has to be announced and proclaimed and taught. It can just be modeled and lived. And then I find that inviting people to remember the moments that they've had of the deepest peace, the deepest joy, and 9 times out of 10, those will end up being moments of being in the natural world. Goes an incredibly long way. And then I think another part of it, and the Native American writer Robin Wall Kimmerer has been really amazing in the way she speaks about this. It's about re-entering reciprocity. That in every culture in the world, if you go back far enough, people existed in a state of reciprocity with the world around them. And there was a giving of offerings, a giving of gifts in return for the life that the earth is giving us. And even if at first you're just going through the motions, putting out that little plate of food for the birds or the animals, or pouring a little bit of whiskey out for your ancestors, really begins to awaken something. And I feel like it has to be that kind of outward physical act to fully awaken it, because it's that engaging that reciprocity in an embodied way as people, and especially as man alive in this world right now, that activates that.
Well, I'm thinking of the little story that Robert Bly told at one of his conferences. For those who don't know Robert Bly, he's a wonderful poet, and he's quite old now. He's 94 now, but he was a men's movement leader, and people get a lot of kind of contrived images when they say men's movement, but it was a divine masculine sort of coming back to wholeness, both male and female together, and trying to heal men and help them be of service in the world, be better human beings. But he talked about actually a real story where cutting off the hair was this big trying to shame the growth of a soul in a way, and this man stood up and said, I actually, my father cut my hair off. I had lovely golden hair and he cut it off, and I was so devastated. I was a young boy. And his grandfather came in and looked at the father and said, I'm taking him with me. So he took the boy out and he drove for hours and hours and hours, and he had the boy blindfolded. And he loved his grandfather. He respected him, and the grandfather loved him. And he could hear a sound in the distance, and he got closer to the boy, and he brought him out of the car and walked him across this sand. And then he took the blindfold off, and before him was this vast ocean, this vast Atlantic Ocean. And he said to him, see all this, my son, this is yours. And I used to think, like, God, that's quite a simplistic story. What does it mean? But it's quite simply what I'm thinking a lot about. Our narrative in life, as in how we perceive what the potential of life is continually attacked every day, and it's reduced. If you look at what he showed him, which is the vastness of nature, which is the vastness of the inner possibility in your soul, and if you take a line in the sand and you draw it, if you mark a line in the sand, and that's your life, that's what you think the size of your life is. But actually what he was showing him was, no, it's not. It's not your hair being cut off. This is all yours. The vastness of those energies inside you is also the reflection of the vastness of the size of the world. They're both the same size. So I love that idea of these, why they break is because their narrative has been reduced so much that they can't see hope. Like, I know a friend of mine, she knew a young man that was in trouble, and this man went to a psychologist, and the psychologist was very cruel and vehement to him. It was like, well, you need to go into this hospital and you need to take these pills, and all the boy wanted was to be brought out to nature, to the ocean, and to a farm, whatever. And I've heard many stories of men who in cities would be, I've seen them on trains. It's like what John Moriarty called them being vampired. They're drained of living, of the possibility of life, I should say. They've accepted this narrative of who they think they're told they should be. And it's like, I guess what you're saying is as well, bringing people back into nature's contact, what it does is increases the idea of possibility in life. And that's why so many people go to the ocean. You don't go up and ask people why you're at the ocean. They'll say, oh, well, it's nice and relaxing. But if you really dug deeper, they'll try and explain or define in you has the reasoning as why they want to stand in front of this vase. It's because they want to be reminded of that in themselves. It's simply a mirror, you know.
Absolutely.
And I think,
Moriarty has that line where he says a psychosis is bigger than the universe that contains it.
Wow.
And so my corollary to that has always been that the way to cure psychosis is to make the world bigger.
Yes, absolutely. Beautifully said, actually. And I think for my own troubles I went through, I put myself into the marriage, as you say, of nature, into the beauty of the world, into the size of a universe contained in the robin's wings. In like, for example, even where I live in this little space here, there's 3 butterflies that live here that have been hibernating here for 3 months, and one of them was beating against the glass yesterday. I was like, okay, it's your time to leave. He went, and then I realized there was 2 more there. And it's simple. Probably it sounds crazy talking like this, but the beauty of living with that butterfly who comes out when I light my fire, he starts fluttering around the room, and it's just the innocence of that. I think it's the innocence, like the return to innocence, the return to Eden, even though we can't go home to that garden allegedly, but that Eden, that innocence is always within, and it's just a matter of finding a new course, and it's like the way the river always finds its path, like, you know. But do you have any poems you could read, or a poem you could read now, actually, from your work, and talk a bit about it? Maybe it would have a relevance to what we were just talking about, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. I have one right up in front of me that weaves in a lot of this, and it was actually inspired in part by some of Moriarty's writing, where he was talking about kingship, and he was talking about the people dream the king onto the road to Tara, and he has that beautiful turn of phrase where he says, "You are now the dream of a people. Walk naked to Tara and claim your royalty." Mm. And I was thinking about that at a point when I was absolutely cast into the deepest abyss, and when I felt like everything was lost and everything was being torn away from me. And I started thinking that part of my problem was that I allowed others' dreams. I allowed the wrong people's dreams of who I was to make my road and shape my reality. And so this poem comes out of that. You let the wrong people dream you onto the wrong road. They dreamed you broken and bleeding and dressed in rags. They dreamed you a stranger with uncouth ways and a barbarian's tongue. They dreamed jagged rocks and a wild storm. And when they saw your eyes that had gazed in the abyss, they dreamed you were a monster born of its depths, and not a wild king who returned from dark waters bearing starlight. But you gathered the 9 woods and built yourself a need fire. By fire you conjured wind that blew away the clouds, to reveal the 7 sisters shining between the horns of the celestial bull, and the hunter who guides you to the Milky Way, which you follow, though you ford across rivers of tears and blood onto a wild road.
Wow. We're in the world of people right now, but we're also still in the world of nature and the divine, and I guess we're navigating sometimes the wrong rivers. We're sort of seeking that which doesn't exist in this horizontal world that we were talking about, and it's the beautiful thing about an overword used, nature or the divine or the great mother, is when you just turn your face to the wind and turn to view a tree in the middle of your calamity. I remember when I was at one of the worst points in my life, and outside my door where I previously lived, when I'd gotten some really terrible news, I opened the door, and there was a very, very old, which I'd always seen because I'd lived there for 6 years, a hawthorn tree. And I'd seen it through all the winters and all the seasons, and endure storms and endure lightning and then see the bloom and the perfection of it, and then shedding its leaves again. And in that moment, a bird landed on the branch, a tiny robin, and just for that split second, amidst the sea of despair, I seen a tiny kernel of revealing to me that everything was going to be okay. That in the deepest recesses was this placid, immortal stillness of energy, whatever you want to call it, God. And just the robin was the messenger to show me that he was like blowing a spark and lighting a fire to take me away from that despair in that moment. Now, the despair stayed with me, but also he almost initiated the beginning of another story, the beginning of another river. And a newspaper would never give you that. A billboard won't give you that. A television won't give you that. Even your best friend won't give you that. It's in the silence and the language of simply of nature. We continually diminish and underestimate that it's not just there for our sustenance, it's there for our recovery, it's there for our future, it's there to align ourselves with the past. Nature's timeless, and all the songs and words are constantly singing through her. It's like these festivals of music, which is there's no music right now, but it's still in the air. But young kids can pick up an instrument, and in a couple of years they've mastered it, because the song doesn't die when someone old passes on. It's in the land. It's just a matter of touching into it again. It's there like a running river to be picked up. And I remember Dan Cronin, this man that I talked about and you knew about, who is the custodian of this really beautiful sacred place called the Paps. If anyone's listening, they should go in Kerry. When I went to see him in the hospital, he was a man who died at 98, beautiful man. When I used to hold his hand, I swear to you, it was like touching Ireland. It was like touching into a river. So I keep thinking of all the people in crisis out there. I was talking to a friend of mine today who said that he's a therapist, and he said it's just a calamity now of people in crisis because of everything that's going on in the world and the pandemic and the whole lot. So what can we do right now, tomorrow morning or tomorrow in the midst of a routine or anything, just to sort of go, right, how do I face into that broken part of myself,
Yeah. And I think it is that verticality that's our way out. We're all trying to run around horizontally, trying to get to a different part of this current confusion, and it just doesn't work that way. We need to go to the deeper layers, and we need to stop allowing the culture to dream our road and ask instead, okay, oldest ancestors who lived before all this happened, what did you dream would be true for me in this time? And feel the solidity of the ground beneath your feet, and ask the granite beneath it what it dreams for you, and go find moving water and listen to the sounds that moving water makes over stone, because that was the language of the Tuatha Dé. Their poetry carried the echo of water over stone and wind and trees. And it's all still available to us. We just need to allow it to. We just need to let go the armor of character as the armor of the character we believe we are. As Dr. Reich, who lived up the road from me in the 1950s, would have said, in order to allow the world and those deeper, older voices to pour in.
The Buddhists say that the more you walk, the more you purify. And when I had a pretty serious car accident, I couldn't drive, so I walked everywhere, and I walked for up until this day, actually, miles. And people see beauty through car windows, or they see it through trains, or look down on the planes from airplanes into the bigger kaleidoscope of land masses. But when you come right down to take each footstep, you're following very old paths. You're actually following in the paths of people who've walked hundreds of thousands of times before on the very same road. And there's one particular road that goes from one part of a village up to where I live, and I've taken this road. I've walked it probably literally a couple of thousand times, and that road is my Damascus. It's my Niagara Falls. It's my Sahara Desert. It's my inner and outer sanctum, and it's my inner and outer despair. I've walked it in the snow, in the deepest of griefs, wounded when I was injured physically, on the full moons, on the half moons, and in the storms, in a lightning storm once. And every time I walk that road, be it day or night or dusk, spring, summer or autumn, every time from that simple walk, I got this encyclopedia of, and I can feel it now, of reflection, of inner knowledge, of being given something that reminded me that life was beautiful. And that was just from that one walk. We don't need to cross the Gobi Desert or sit in an ashram or stand on the top of the mountain Himalayas. There's no need to go out there. The there is already here. It's just your perception, you know?
Yeah. If you're in the middle of the city and you can find, I guess it wouldn't be this time of year, but if you're in the middle of the city and in springtime you can find where the one dandelion is trying to grow through the sidewalk, that will teach you everything you need to know about reemergence.
And is that the hope for the world, in a way, that what you just said there, it's something I think myself, the idea of a flower growing up to the concrete in the middle of so many different political calamities and biological calamities and financial calamities, there's that one tiny image of the seed starting to grow again. And there is a sense of, it's a big word to use, a very religious word in one way, but I love the idea of resurrection. That is that which has come to a complete ending and destruction and seems hopeless and seems at a finite end, suddenly is re-emerged and reborn, like the butterfly, into a new identity. And it's the story of the butterfly I tell of when the larva takes its last journey, when the caterpillar who's liquefied takes its last journey to form into the butterfly tries to come out of the hole, but the hole is so small it takes it a long time. It's very painful, and they did an experiment where they cut the hole to make it larger, and the butterfly came out, but it died because the journey was too easy. They then examined the top of the hole and realized there was a tiny chemical that was the last part of the metamorphosis. That is, it coated the wings of the butterfly. The tight journey was so it could coat every particle of its wings so it could fly. And maybe our humanity, our crisis, our ending here, our damage, our darkness is actually just that coating happening. That crisis, they say it's the word for opportunity, and courage. We're moving through that part rather than being stuck in it. And that's the ultimate vertical of all, isn't it? That we're actually moving through from out of those shadows into some form of resurrection,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think if we take the metaphor all the way deep down of the flower breaking through the sidewalk, we can think about the fact that, first of all, every place that's been paved over in the world, there are roots and seeds waiting to come back to life, that come back to life very quickly once we get out of the way. And what covers them over gets out of the way very quickly if we don't get in the way of the wind and the rain. And in fact, concrete and pavement are quite brittle. And when things that are brittle try to cover things up, are subjected to the forces of nature, they break and other things come through. And I think the same can be said of our culture, that we have this kind of global monoculture right now that's trying to cover everything up, but it's brittle. And we're seeing all the places that it's cracking. But places that it's cracking are revealing what was pushed away. And I've long had the intuition when I've heard the stories of the Tuatha leaving the world and becoming the Dynasty, that when they left, they took something that was fundamental to the wholeness of the world with them. But through these cracks, possibility comes. It was so interesting. This past solstice was the first time in many, many years that there were no living humans actually present in the chamber at Newgrange as the sunlight came through. But at the same time, because of the live stream happening, there were more people placing their attention onto that light going into the darkness at the heart of the chamber, which is the very place where Manannán, the god of the sea, sang the enchantment that hid the other world from us. And I felt like that was a moment of opening. And I think that, and of course, when we go to the stories of Manannán, Moriarty talks most frequently about how Manannán comes and brings a silver branch. When you hold the silver branch, you can see the world as he sees it and look down to the root of the well that is the source of all the waters of the world. And Moriarty says that it was at Conlo's otherworld well that he learned that being human was a habit that could be broken. And so we can break the habit of our particular kind of humanity when we let that older way of seeing break through. And I feel like we are at a time of tremendous potential for that. I think we're at a time where things aren't, the direction of things isn't fully determined. I think
it's true, yeah.
If we buckle down and hold on to the old ways, it's going to get, not the old ways, but if we hang on to the world that we're used to too tightly, we're going to get ripped and torn by the earthquakes that shake it. But if we allow that opening, and to open us, then I think there's the potential of life moving through us, allowing us to break the habits of our particular way of humanity and find our true form.
It's what Joseph Campbell had said about underneath all that shadows, and Jung said obviously it's all that gold, and this image of, I remember he had a painting of an image of all this gold pouring through all these rocks, there in the harsh cracks of what you think is impenetrable is actually all this beauty, and one of the things I've been saying recently in my other interview, I said, in the end, all darkness turns into beauty. And even in the worst griefs, when you've had people die in you and stuff like that, there's a terror and a feeling of lack of safety around grief. But ultimately, over the process of grieving, they attain hopefully some part of a state of grace, both for the person moved on and also in that you've added them, your feeling, their energies, their memories to a larger part of you. So I love the idea of ancestors, and this is what I'm trying to communicate maybe with a lot of men and people in Ireland, is that your ancestors have are relying on you to speak for them. They've, through their grace and their passing on, they've passed on their memories, their achievements, their survival, their beauty, their poetry onto the very person who's now the person that's living right now, has all this line behind him. And when you say something like calling the ancestors, a person go, what do you mean by that? It means that all you're saying is reminding them and you of this timeless link between those that have yet to come and those who have gone, and that you stand in the center right now, in the center of it all. And that should make you feel empowered. It should make you feel like, if you can understand that that's a noble thing to think about, then we wouldn't take corruption. We'd want to look at someone to be a proper king, a proper leader. And Ireland has a history of great orators, of people who've had, Daniel O'Connell had 1 million people stand on the mountain. I believe when a true leader comes, that you recognize it in your soul, but you sort of have to, you can't recognize it until you've found it again in yourself, I think. What do you think?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because all that leader's doing is awakening people to their own divinity.
Yeah.
And if anybody who's doing anything else is a demagogue. And I think people keep looking for saviors, and there can be salvation in connection with another if that connection with another helps you remember yourself and helps you remember that you are part of the land come to life. But if you transfer authority, it's the difference. John Trudell would talk about the difference between power and authority. John Trudell, the great Native American poet and activist who died a few years ago. And he would say that authority is when you give your power is what moves through us naturally. Authority is what happens when power is given over and invested in another. Wow. And I think, true leaders seek to help people stand in their power and demagogues seek to hold on to authority, and both come in all kinds of guises.
So ultimately, in the end, we have what you call contemporary culture, but that band-aid is coming off, and people are left sort of like, when you lift up a rock and you see all the insects scrambling because you're lifting up. If this rock was the rock of the overculture, like you said, the monolithic culture, and you lift it up, we're left what we think is in a form of nakedness, but it's actually a blessing, because then a lot of people are having to, in these lockdowns, reflect hugely about their lives, their dreams, their goals, their past, their presents, their futures. And some people are finding it very difficult to cope, to see for the first time, to look for the first time outside of the so-called structure of their normal, heavily routined existences. And I just hope that somewhere amidst of this sort of entrapment right now, that people can see that there's potential blessing emerging of reflection. If a humanity, I guess, is forced to reflect en masse at the same time, it can bring up all sorts of terrible demons, in a sense of what things people don't want to look at. But isn't that where the blessing is? Uh, they say that a group of people together who've been betrayed, if they gather together, there's suddenly a huge potential for healing.
There can be, or there can be a huge potential for addiction to sharing each other's trauma-shaped identity. And I think that there are two real dangers, and our culture has erred on the side of the danger of trying to pretend that the horrific and the dark isn't there, and that as we've exiled more and more things into the shadow, we've been unable to really deal with and transform them. But the flip side of that is that the abyss is not the destination. The abyss is what we need to cross in order to get to the destination. Mm-hmm. And there can be the addiction to pain, the addiction to suffering, the confusing wounds, the wound itself with the medicine. And ultimately, if we really want to transform, we need to, yes, engage what we've exiled and be with that grief, but not let that be the goal. Let that be the process of we're going through. Allow the alchemy to happen. So the word vitriol originally comes from an acronym for an alchemical formula, which meant travel to the interior of the earth and find the hidden stone to rectify the poison. Mm. But, and so, yes, in that poison can be transformed into alchemical gold, but it has to be transformed. You don't just drink the poison and expect the gold.
But I've been thinking a lot about, say, listening to music, for example, or having a moment in nature, like a beautiful sunset. Like those very beautiful sunsets here in the last couple of weeks. In the winters, it was very stark, and there was ice on the ground, but it was very clear and very cold and very beautiful now. The landscape gets kind of drenched in this very delicate gold, and it moved me. And I think of the word, that moved me, you moved me, or I was moved by that piece of music or moved by that poem. But when you think of the actual word, it's a verb. It's to move. It's moving something in you. So that's where I'm at right now. It's like I want things to be moved by again. That's why there's no heart. You don't see music right now. There's very little you can't go see these things, and sort of there's a hunger for people to be moved. And otherwise, it's like, you leave a barrel of water and it gets stagnant. Like the river needs to move to find its course. And I think the beauty of our humanness is that if we can live more in a state of awe and to be moved by things and pursue journeys of finding places that you want to be, where you can be moved, even if it's in front of an ocean. And I took a journey all across Ireland last summer when there was a bit of space and there was no lockdown primarily, and I had so many moving synchronistic experiences, swimming in rivers in Donegal and underneath these waterfalls, and and it was like, what a privilege it is to live here, to know that you have heaven on your doorstep. And the ultimate invitation is nature is always calling you to be moved. Therefore, nature is always calling you to heal your life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there another poem that we could finish up with soon? The time has gone so fast, we've barely scratched the surface, but do you have another one of your poems you could read for us and tell us a bit about it?
So, my teacher's teacher, Victor Anderson, would often use a turn of phrase that shows up in both Irish and Welsh and Scottish legend a lot, which is mad, dead, or a poet. Right. And the idea being that when you encounter that which is greater than yourself, when you encounter the divine, it breaks things open, and you basically you end up going into madness, being killed, or resolving the madness into poetry. And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I've been thinking about the figure of Mad Sweeney Galt, in the old Irish stories, who was a king the time the Christianity was first coming, and the bishop was building a church on sacred ground, and Sweeney went to try to stop it, and the bishop cursed him with madness, and then he fled into the forest. But what's interesting is that the word the old texts use for madness was not a word that only meant crazy. It also meant wild, and it also referred to the poets who would go off into the wild and eat mushrooms in stone chambers and try to dream back a different reality to bring back to the people. And so, thinking about that and going through a time of big transformation this summer, this poem came. They called Sweeney mad because he preferred the bugling of the red deer to the sound of the horn in the hunt, and fled the company of his fellow men for a forest then so vast you could leap from tree to tree. One footstep onto his wild road, and you too will find madness or poetry or death. The art lies in resolving madness into poetry to forestall death. Dream enough of the stag and the robeless king, and you'll find yourself wandering down on Loch Fionn, not noticing when the path gives way to a deer trail, and then the opening created by the way roots follow underground streams, until you kneel down among the alders at the water's edge, digging calamus, the fire of its root lighting the fire at your root, and the fire in your heart and the fire in your head, which spills forth from your lips as you join in the song of the blackbirds, calling the world to flower and fruit and seed once more.
It's almost like an incantation, isn't it? It's like you know, I've lit a lot of these big fires here, and it's like, you know, it's like you're trying to ignite the relationship again, you know? And
absolutely.
And it's just, I keep thinking about people who are in pain right now and in the world in all sorts of different forms. And what would you say, whoever's listening who's suffering right now, who's really unsure of if they even can't go on or who to turn to or what to turn to, what would you say if you're standing in front of that person right now?
Well, I would say, first of all, that stars born and were died to form the molecules that make up your body. And those molecules danced through 1,000 different forms to evolve into you exactly as you are right now. And there is exactly one opportunity for the world to experience itself in this exact form. And ultimately, I think the only thing that's true blasphemy is to rob from ourselves or each other that one opportunity that the evolving universe has created by bringing us into these exact forms. And when it feels like everything is breaking, remember, psychosis is bigger than the universe that contains it, and you've been trying to make your world too small. And through the cracks, other things can come through. And there are different possibilities, because if you turn towards bitterness and you turn towards hatred, that invites things you don't want to come through. But if you turn instead toward the living world outside you, that will come into the cracks, and that will dream you back into being. And even if there's not a single human who you can trust, if you can trust the granite under your feet, if you can trust the water, if you can trust an oak, you can go into relation with those things and remake yourself and be remade by them.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to end this, actually, because there's a lot of nature in what you're saying, and there's a lot of sense of compassion, and we all need that now, and it's lovely to know, isn't it, in the end, that we're all just sort of servants to something a lot bigger, and that medicine you're talking about never ever ever goes away. That idea of that you're something way more than you're being told that you are, and not to feel ashamed of that, to know that it's okay to grieve, because grief is movement. It moves something out. It's like a block of ice that gets moved out of the heart, and that we almost need to celebrate grief in a way, that it's like the wakes in Ireland,
Yeah.
where at the threshold of death was also this great celebration. And I think we need to smile at ourselves a lot more, at our frailties and our indignations, and know that we're all paddling this boat together. I love the saying. There's something I wrote about recently, that we all have the same, we all have different destinies but the same fate.
Yeah.
We will meet at the river together. One man I know passed away a couple of years ago had said that it's like we're just rivers meeting for a while. But eventually, then we part again, but then we all come back to the ocean.
Yeah.
Because we do mourn for people who are gone, but at the same time, I truly feel that we all meet up again. So it's life is really just a lot of meeting and parting, and I think that's why I find I can deal with grief a little bit easier now, because I know that it's almost a source of growth, and that we're gonna come back home anyway. We're just out for a while exploring.
Yeah. Well, in ancient Irish medicine, there was this idea that we had the three cauldrons within us. The cauldron of incubation that was at our root, where the gods had poured some of the essence of starlight into us. And the cauldron that was in our heart was the cauldron of motion, which was the cauldron that was fed by the senses, and where we processed everything we experienced in the world. But that word motion is really important, because it's allowing it to move, allowing both the grief and the joy to move, that sets the rhythms of our lives. It's only when stagnation happens that we cease to live. And then when the cauldron of motion is in its proper position, then the cauldron of poetry, the cauldron of wisdom that's in the head, can pour wisdom down to fill and refill us over and over again.
I hope, Sean, it was lovely talking to you. There's so much I felt like we wanted to talk about. I hardly got to touch into it, but we sort of. I'm glad you're here tonight, just talking in such a strange day on this Monday. And they say this is they call us Blue Monday. I think it's allegedly the hardest day of the year. I mean, everybody has different days that are hard through any of the years, but I hope that people listening will have just got a little taste of the medicine that you brought to a lot of lives. And it was lovely to hear you speak and share that vast cauldron of wisdom that you have stored and keep renewing all the time. But I hope that we can both meet on the real path of Ireland one day when everything opens up again, and share another adventure, because I know we traveled a bit around when you were here in the West, and it was nice to sort of have a mutual understanding of the great gratitude of the gift of Ireland. I think Ireland is a gift to the world in a way, so.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to sharing those roads with you again, and always grateful to be sharing this wild road of life with you.
Well, Sean Donoghue, thank you very, very much. We'll talk to you soon, and I'll leave your all your contact links underneath the podcast. You should contact Sean for many different purposes, and he does a lot of service and help to people around the world. This is Alan Cooke here with another episode ending of Ireland Speaks. I hope wherever you are, whatever you're feeling, whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, wherever you're standing, that you're guided, you're loved, and that you can find your way home. And that's the hope for all of us, okay? Good night and take care.